Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody. I'm Christopher Hawthorne. I'm the Chief Design Officer for the City of Los Angeles. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to say a few words by way of introduction before handing it over to David Levitas, our facilitator for the discussion this afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. On behalf of the Mayor's Office and our supporters and partners in this effort, this low-rise housing initiative, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the first of our 5 planned community engagement listening sessions. Today's session will focus on the connections between public investment in infrastructure, mobility, and open space with housing affordability, housing production, and neighborhood stability. A key part of our low-rise initiative is a design challenge to be launched later this fall, asking architects and other design professionals to help us imagine new typologies for low-rise housing in Los Angeles that are sustainable, affordable, and aid rather than threaten community cohesion, and that build on relevant precedents from the history of Los Angeles architecture and urbanism where appropriate, even as they help us imagine new paths forward. It has been our priority since deciding to pursue such a challenge to put community engagement sessions at the very heart of our effort. The session today and the 4 that follow are meant to give potential participants in the design challenge a nuanced sense of how the diverse debates over the future of low-rise neighborhoods are playing out across Los Angeles. Proposals from those participants will be reviewed by juries that include panelists in these listening sessions, among others. And the proposals from the design professionals will be meant not as the final answers to these questions about the future of low-rise neighborhoods, but as a significant way to move the conversation ahead another step. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Mayor's Office, in particular Alejandro Gonzalez, for their work in putting this series of conversations together. I'd like to thank the James Irvine Foundation, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and our other supporters. And most of all, I'd like to thank all of the participants today for bringing your time, your wisdom, and expertise to the discussion. A couple of logistical details. This session is being recorded and will be added to the website for the initiative when it launches, which is likely to be in the latter half of October. If you have questions during this conversation, if you're not a panelist, please type them into the chat, and Alejandro and I will do our best to send them along to David, our facilitator for today's conversation. David Levitas is a PhD in history and urban studies from USC and founder and executive director of LA Forward. It's my pleasure to hand it over to him now. David.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christopher. Really grateful to be here with all of you. Can everybody hear me okay? I have the
Yes.
AC on the background because, you know, all those hot September days. So really happy to be here with all of you. Like Christopher said, founder, executive director of LA Forward, which is organizes folks, particularly in middle-class communities, on issues of social justice and working coalition with many other groups, especially those grounded in marginalized communities. So happy to be here with you all today to talk about this important subject around the future of low-rise communities, how we can get away from being reactive and be more proactive about our planning, how we can be better about engaging community, particularly communities that have historically and presently are being impacted negatively by racial, class, and other forms of oppression, exploitation, and really learn about how do we listen more effectively, how do we respond more effectively. I'm really happy to be joined here today by our really amazing panelists. We're going to have folks from Destination Crenshaw, from Alliance for Community Transit LA, ACT LA, and from Mujeres de la Tierra. And so I want to give each of them, I'm not going to go too long and talk too much about them. I want to just give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. So if I can start with my friend and colleague, Mariana Huerta-Jones from ACT LA. Love for you to just say a little bit about who you are and what ACT LA does.
Hey everyone, thank you again for inviting us to join this really important panel discussion. I'm Mariana, I'm the Senior Coalition and Communications Manager with ACT LA, and we're a coalition of 38 organizations working around the issues of transit equity, anti-displacement strategies, affordable housing, and equitable community development. And we came together because of the need to address the issues of displacement throughout the city of LA and the county, and we've done a lot of work at the state level as well. But regarding the massive transit expansion and how we can ensure that new investments in public transit and other public investments could benefit community members. I'm a planner by trade, but do a lot of the advocacy work with our organization.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariana. Really appreciate your presence here and all your work. Next, I want to turn to my friend, Tafari Bain, from who's the chief strategy officer for Ciclavia and involved in Destination Crenshaw, and his colleague, Jason from Destination Crenshaw. So Tafari.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tafari Bain with Destination Crenshaw. I'm also chief strategist of Ciclavia, as David mentioned. And I'm also a commissioner for the city of Los Angeles with the Rec and Parks Department. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, been here all my life, and have worked in the community development and urban planning sector since I was 18 years old on these issues, working both on the community side and on I've also worked with some groups doing affordable housing development, Trust South LA, and Strategic Action for Just Economy, doing urban planning and urban and community organizing work around issues affecting South Los Angeles and the city as a whole. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you so much for being here. I'd love to have your colleague, Jason Foster from Destination Crenshaw, share a little bit about himself and and what Destination Crenshaw is and what you're all about.
Yeah, thanks, David. My name is Jason Foster. I'm the Chief Administrator of Destination Crenshaw. Destination Crenshaw is a 1.3-mile open-air art museum and infrastructure improvement along Crenshaw Boulevard. It was started in response to the Metro line being built along Crenshaw at grade, which hasn't happened in an urban center in this country in a very long time. So community members came together over a series of meetings, and actually 4 years in the making, was creating Destination Crenshaw, which is streetscapes, park space, parklets, access points, but also economic development initiatives and art and culture initiatives to really help the community push forward and participate in the creation of the Metro line and all the other opportunities that are going to come from it. So my background is in finance by education, but I've been working in nonprofits my entire career, circling around community development, affordable housing. In Los Angeles, I worked at River LA for 8 years, focused on macro level scale of public infrastructure. And Destination Crenshaw allows me to, as a community member and a community resident, focus more on the micro implementation of infrastructure.
Great. No, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate all the important work you're doing in the community. Next, last but not least, I want to give Irma Munoz from Mujeres de la Tierra, the founder and executive director there, a chance to introduce herself. Irma? Irma?
Hello, now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm Irma Munoz, and the founder and executive director of an environmental equity organization founded 15 years ago. Our mission is to provide capacity and inspire women and their children to lead and own their issues in their neighborhood. We focus mostly in the Northeast Los Angeles area, although we do a little bit of work in South LA. I'm a governor's appointment to the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, a mayor's appointee to Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, which I currently chair both. Um, I have my degree from UC San Diego in urban studies and a law degree as well. And what I've learned, my nonprofit has excelled in community engagement and listening to folks. So we've been successful because although we're not housing in focus, that seems to be one of the top 3 issues that most of the residents we speak to and listen to talk a lot about. So thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
We're very happy to have you here. Looking forward to really good discussion this afternoon about so many of the topics that Christopher mentioned. We know, I know from my background as a historian, and so many people just know from their personal experience that while there are many neighborhoods out there that have been historically disinvested from, redlined, subject to predatory finance, and are needing resources, there's a lot of reasons for those same communities to be wary of change, whether from initial city building efforts or urban renewal and slum clearance efforts or gentrification, displacement. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons for concern and skepticism among communities. Today, we want to try to be proactive and think about how do we, and learn from all of you, from the panelists, about how do we be proactive? How do we listen effectively, community? How do we respond effectively? How in our both design and in actual and material benefits, how do we make sure that change comes to neighborhood, new housing comes to neighborhoods, new development comes to neighborhoods in ways that are reinforce and benefit those who are in those neighborhoods already and who've put in the time there, and not purely people who already are wealthy and powerful. So that's the subject for discussion today. And I'd really love to start off by just asking a broad question around, and anybody can really jump in and answer this. Why do you think, if you could talk just a little bit about this why question, why is community engagement important? And what are some examples of really why you've seen its importance? And we don't have to have everybody talk about this, but I'd love to hear from a couple of you.
Well, I'll get started. Community engagement is important because anything that we build or design or anything that is new or just changing in a neighborhood has to get the buy-in and the support of the folks that are going to be impacted by it. And the term community engagement many times is used loosely. It's usually something at the bottom of the list if it's a project that's the least funded because they don't think it's important. But over the years, I've seen a high level of sophistication for many residents and neighbors who really want to be a part of whatever is taking place and they want their voices heard. That is the area that Mujeres de la Tierra excels in. And what we have found out is that it's important to listen, but it's more important to understand what people are saying to you and that you ask the right questions. And even the most timid of people, when you ask them a question, ask for their opinion, they're willing to share it. And I think that many people have felt very disenfranchised and overlooked and ignored for too long. And so people are pushing back and people are organizing on all levels to say, if you want to come into our neighborhood, if you want to come into our space, then we need to be a part of whatever you're thinking about doing. And I think it makes it for a stronger neighborhood and a stronger city. And actually, it strengthens community life when people feel that they have an investment and we're part of something great that has been built. And so I do believe that our community engagement, we have to get rid of these translation of meetings. So if you're in a monolingual Spanish community, the presentations need to be done in Spanish, the PowerPoints need to be in Spanish with simultaneous English translation or vice versa. Because what happens when you do a Spanish translation, the person speaks for 5 minutes and the Spanish speakers get 30 seconds of whatever that was said in the 5 minutes. And it's truly unfair. So we've got to look at it through a different lens. So it is effective, it is powerful and meaningful for all those involved.
Thank you. It's,
I'd love to jump in.
Sorry. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I was just taking it back to my experience at Trust South LA. We worked on this project called Roland Curtis Gardens, and it was a transit-oriented development that was completely affordable housing, and it actually ended up replacing a development that was basically owned by maybe a not as reputable owner, was to put it politely. And that owner was harassing a bunch of the tenants, and a group of community groups got together and helped to organize those tenants. And from start to end, the community engagement process that happened there, both in terms of a community organizing process to support tenants, but there was a concrete community engagement development process that occurred where residents were included in the design of the building, conversations included in the programming of the spaces, included in the conversations around affordability levels, and those hard conversations, and really created a situation where, I worked on that project when I was there like 7 years ago, and they just opened it last year. And years and years of process it took to get this building built, and those residents stuck with that building that whole way through, and supported that project and made a stronger project, at the end of the day. And I think that's an aspect of it too. Really good community engagement not only gives the community ownership over a project, ownership over what even if they don't technically own it, but they feel ownership over the project. And it creates a better project, a project that speaks to the needs of a community, that residents are behind, that residents will protect. And I think those are really important aspects to why community engagement needs to really be invested in. And too often I've seen development projects come in and never put resources towards the community engagement process, never put resources towards hiring good teams to do that, or partnering with community organizations to do that in real ways. And it always feels like it comes at detriment to a project, and has resulted in some really, really hard fights over projects as well. So I can't speak more highly to the power of good community engagement in these situations.
Great. Mariana or Jason, anything you'd like to share about why it's important for you, or otherwise we'll go on to a related question?
I'll just jump in really quickly. I just think that, I think a lot of us that either grew up in LA or even like people that moved here from out of town complain about LA, right? Traffic and all these other things, lack of trees, right? But our city was designed in a way that excluded people from engagement, and how, residents, people who've lived here for decades or generations, could be involved in the future of their neighborhood. So I think that we need to reverse that. We need to make sure that, all of the policies and the plans of the past are not repeated, and ensure that we're proactively engaging and being really, thoughtful and meaningful about including people in the future of our neighborhoods, and how we're going to develop going forward. So that for me, it's about like reversing the, racist, classist past of our city and, our region, frankly. So that's why I think it's really important, in addition to all the other comments shared.
Yeah, great. No, it's such an important thing to keep in mind, what you're saying, Mariana, about this legacy of classism, but especially about racism and redlining. So many of these elements that have been the opposite of community engagement, listening to the community. So we've really established, I think, why it matters and its power. I'm really curious to hear from any and all of you about what does authentic engagement look like for you and from the communities you work with. There's a lot of, I think, Tafari, when we spoke the other day, you used the word dog and pony show that sometimes developers or planners will put on. What does it look like to do it right? How do you actually do authentic community engagement? So I'd love to hear from any of you. I know,
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think, if I could say anything that kind of points to effective community engagement, is a literal change in either the design or the makeup of a project. A lot of times development is prescriptive, whether it's through design or a pro forma, how much the developer wants to make. But if there is a process in which there is a literal change, and it's by the community members' design, that is community engagement. So if there's no change whatsoever, there has been no community engagement. There have been a series of meetings and conversations, but no one was engaged enough to understand what their input is, and it wasn't actually taken in to then produce another result. So I think that the equation of what community engagement is important, because without that, you don't actually get the desired result of community members, which then creates the same feeling of not being heard, which is worse when you're actually talking. So it's one thing for us advocates to get community members to the meeting. It's another thing if they leave the meeting and aren't heard, because us as advocates, we hear that, right? Like we actually have to synthesize that information and bring it back. So that's like my long and short answer of it.
Great, that's great. Other folks have thoughts on what is authentic community engagement for you and the community you work with?
Well, I think community engagement, the result is community participation and community empowerment. And there are very few people, none of who I've heard today, and so grateful to hear people's comments. Folks thinks it's just something to check off, and it isn't. And authentic community engagement is when you go anywhere and everywhere, as we do. I mean, we go into beauty parlors and barbershops and go to bus stops, go to laundromats. We go to where the people are. And so we can ask them what they think. Many times community feels that everything's a done deal. And many times it is a done deal, you know, that they already have the plans kind of done, and they're going to give us the set of plans to say, oh, we're going to change it. And we learned a lot in the process when we were doing work along the Los Angeles River, because much of our work has been done there. And what we found out is that community members want to be dealt with facts, science, and data. They don't want fear tactics. They want information. The way you get respectability from the community is when you're transparent and you tell them the truth, even though maybe they might not like what you have to say to them. If it is factual, that's the way you gain respect. And it should be, in my opinion, community who drives a project, a community who says what they want, what is good for them. They're the end users. How do they want it? When do they want it? And how it should be done. But we're not there yet in many places. I haven't seen that. Because to really engage a community means that you know how to listen. It means that you think that they have the intelligence and the wherewithal to make these kinds of decisions. You know, people go into communities, and the communities that we work in, I always tell the residents, I don't have an opinion on what happens here because I don't live here. You're the ones who are vested. You're the ones who get to determine what takes place. And so for me, it's become a science, actually, because I've been doing it for over 30 years. And I find that when you ask people in sincerity a question about what can impact their lives, especially those of their children, they're going to be very honest with you. And I think that we have to be ready for whatever answers and opinions that they give you. Sometimes we who ask the questions are not ready. We're hoping to get a different answer. And so for a respectful community, then we need to be respectful of their opinions and their thoughts.
Great. No, I mean, I think this really highlights some key features of what effective community engagement and authentic community engagement looks like in terms of actually being open to listening and changing things based on that, rather than checking a box because it's a legal requirement, or even just listening to avoid opposition or get buy-in superficially. So, Mariana, is there anything you'd like to share about what do you think authentic engagement looks like?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. I also think it's really challenging, and I think specifically around like a specific project. If you think about like a developer that has to do the community engagement, and then after their project is done, they're gone. Like, was that really authentic? Like, how deep were those connections, right? But when it comes to like plans or like more neighborhood level planning or engagement, I think, yeah, a lot of what has already been shared, like making meetings that are at the times that people are available to show up in the evenings or weekends or in the preferred language, ensuring that it's going at a pace that community members feel comfortable in, not like rushing through something just because we have to meet deadlines or things like that. But I also think authentic engagement requires money, like funding the communities that are doing the work, and we don't see that often enough. Like, we're expected to turn out people to hearings and these, other community engagement events, but that requires like time and people's commitment. So I think authentic engagement has to be tied to funding for community groups.
Yeah, I think so often the money in projects goes to relatively high-paid consultants or whatever to do the presentations, and they're doing okay for themselves, and the people, especially lower income folks, are the ones who are being asked to give comment and they're not compensated, or the organizations that actually have the ties there aren't compensated. So you see that imbalance, playing out. I've certainly seen it. I'm curious for any of you, I guess especially at Destination Crenshaw, I would love to know like what you all did to really hear concerns about displacement and respond to them. The project undertaking is remarkable, and I'll let you say more about how it's intended to work and its purpose, and especially in relationship to community and especially displacement. But curious what you did and what you learned along the way. What do you think you'd do again next time, and what would you
Tafari, please. I'll let Tafari answer that because he's been on our community advisory council, like as a member. So I think it's probably better for him.
And I thought he was going to take the ball, and I was like, okay, cool, I got it.
Sir.
So I think there's a lot of layers to that, right? The project itself is a response to gentrification concerns, right? Like from its initial onset being a direct response in a lot of ways to the metro train line construction. So I think there's a constant conversation happening about this, like it's like we're always answering these questions. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of answering those questions has been about, there's been constant layers of community meetings, from the layer of like community advisors, so people who have strong long-term ties and experience in the community, leaders of community leaders and other I can't use the word letter Q right now. And clear leadership of the community, but also a layer of meetings with youth, meetings with neighborhood councils, meetings with churches, just all layers of community meetings. And also, I think the strong partnership with the council office has helped, because having a clear community leader from the council, from the city side, a champion in a lot of ways, gives a face to the project, but also allows another clear point of engagement. I think that the thing about it is, a lot of people know that who they could call they want to complain about Destination Crenshaw. Like there's a lot of folks who are taking input and bringing that back to the body for conversation and discussion, concerns, and folks hear about them, and we respond. And we respond to a lot of these conversations, either face to face or through our social media, through our emails out. I think we actively engage in the dialogue. I think it's part of the dynamic of it. At the same time, I think we are very clear about what the project is and is not. I think it's also very important. It's the Destination Crenshaw, as Jason opened up, it's a 1.3 mile long art installation, like, to be clear, right? Like, and I think its relationship to, it's tied to a particular community, it being for Black folks in South LA, and it being about lifting up the Black community's artistic kind of heritage in the city, gives it a validity in the conversation. I think that people really understand, and that speaks directly to issues of concern, the displacement of a culture. And so I think that a lot of those things have helped to create and give us tools to be able to, to walk through this conversation with, feeling principled, feeling grounded, but feeling accountable. And I think that, all those things are really important in terms of, dealing with what is going to be a constant conversation, and that we don't expect to just, have a dialogue and never hear another word about this. We feel constantly as projects needing to hold ourselves to the measure of combating these issues and being and serving the needs of the community we're here to protect. So I'll start off with that, Jason. I'll leave it to you to go get some more nuts and bolts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we really focus on the small businesses on the corridor as like an anchor in our conversation, because Black businesses are the largest employer of Black people. So the health of our Black businesses is actually the health of our families. And it is directly related to the affordability issue in housing. So the better our Black businesses along the corridor perform, the better income people make, and the more they're able to kind of, live the lives and actualize their lives to where they want to be. I also think that, it is around change. This is around your community changing, and bringing people into a conversation is generally the first step that's never done, right? So like having conversations around what is happening, like this is happening, right? So like, I think that is breaking the first wave of, I don't know what's happening, or turning my back on change, right? Because like Tafari said, we get a lot of complaints, right? Like we get constantly, we're having conversations, but those complaints are really lack of information and lack of knowledge around what's going on, right? And I think that it's the advocate's job typically to have those conversations. And what we're trying to do is have them at a project scale, right? We can try to have them at a cultural scale. Because once we're having it at that scale, then that is actually able to get outside of our direct one-on-one range. So then we can start thinking about these conversations around affordability, because how do you talk about affordability when you can't afford what you have, right? So like, I don't want to have a conversation around what new development's going to do if my house right now is already too expensive, right? So we need to have a conversation around that and really address the core issues of being Black in South LA and really living in a safe space, which doesn't happen, right? So like, I think these all conversations are layered, but I feel like affordability is almost a privileged conversation to be having. So to be able to have that, we've already addressed 2 or 3 things, which is, pretty good if we're doing that.
And just to be clear too, we use the art to deal with issues of economy because we understand that there's a relationship there, particularly for our community. Right. We understand that our art is a major driver of money in this country, and us claiming ownership over that through this project is a tool for our, we understand it being a tool, and so that's why there's some of those threads going through. Mm-hmm. And I just want to tease up the thing again about door knocking, because we door knock, these conversations are on all levels, and we go to people's doors and we're door knocking about this project, like the other speakers spoke. And even my Ciclavia hack, I'll put that on for 2 seconds. We door knock on Ciclavia. We door knock every door on Ciclavia. Is like, community engagement is going to where people are at all the time and being willing to have every conversation they want to have with you at that moment. And you compartmentalize these things so you can be efficient, but you're willing to engage in these dialogues because the dialogue is the process and change.
That's incredibly valuable. And I could, we could talk for a day about, hours about the actual intricacies of how you get in there. And it sounds to me from all of this is that it's, it's not just about holding a meeting, but it's door knocking, it's going businesses, churches, laundromats, everything that Irma said, that it's like actual community engagement actually involves going out into the community, and not just having one meeting or 3 meetings and calling it a day. Mariana, if you're willing and able, I'd love to hear, a little bit about kind of what, how ACT LA, since you all, and I'm a member of ACT LA, or LA Forward is, how you all, try to, at the policy level, the systems level for the city and county and state and beyond, what kind of systems are you all trying to create that incentivize or require or push for community engagement, if that makes sense?
Incentives for community engagement. I think, at the policy level, we are really engaged around ensuring that when new development is coming in, that is receiving, additional density or additional value to a project, that it'll bring benefits to a community. That would look like, affordable housing or local jobs for the, residents living close by, or, ensuring that if it's a mixed use project, that it'll, include community serving businesses within that project. So I think the engagement piece is really important because, in so many cases, projects have come into neighborhoods that were proposing, market rate or luxury projects. And community members got, involved and pushed back. And, that's when dialogue happened with developers and some benefits came out of it. But, I think we realized we can't take on every developer, or we can't do that project by project. So we have to make sure that, at the city level or neighborhood level, we can ensure that there's a lot more planning that's happening with community members and engaging residents to make those decisions before projects are proposed. So I think just ensuring that, developers are more educated about how, community engagement can happen. And then, there's a little bit more of the incentives around what kind of, value their project is going to get around density. That happens more with, city planning, things like that. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the process, and then it's also ensuring that there's material benefits, there's anti-displacement provisions and material benefits that are guaranteed through the policy process, right? And I think, from what I've seen, both being on my neighborhood council in West LA and the studies, it's if you're providing a tangible community benefit, people are much more likely to accept a more dense project or a bigger project. They're like, oh, this isn't going to displace me, and or it's going to help the community directly, and can make all the difference in the world as long as people feel like there's something in it for them. And it's not just the abstract thing of, it's certainly not just for profit, but not just the abstract thing of increasing housing supply, which doesn't, resonate with people, and for understandable reasons if they're lower income. I'm going to kind of dive into about some specific projects soon, but this question that my friend Aparna asked in the chat, I think is a really great one, which is about, how do we talked about door knocking, talked about going out in these physical spaces. In the era of this pandemic, where so much of what's happening, including this very panel, is happening on Zoom, and there's so many challenges. If you have time and space and technology, you can teleconference across the world very easily. But with all the challenges around lack of internet, lack of childcare issues, so many other issues, I think this format can be especially challenging. So I guess my question is twofold. One is, what are good practices for getting community input using technology like this in this era? And then two is how are you, in order to engage community members, particularly low-income community members facing an intersection of a lot of challenges, how are you addressing that? So how do we do community engagement in 2020, second half of 2020? So I'd love anybody who has some insight on that to share their take.
So I mean, for some of my projects, for example, this this Saturday, we have our first some of our projects are trying to get back out the streets a little bit, just to be frank, right? So we're doing a partnership with Council District 8. They're installing, it's called Broadway Our Way. They're just installing a series of protected bike lanes along Broadway. And so we've designed something that should be COVID safe, socially distant, a little bike ride. Bike ride activities are safe right now, relatively. And we're trying to keep it small. It's very targeted to the South LA neighborhood and just the residents in the right direct community. So there's another way we're thinking about keeping it safe in this, hyper local, very targeted kind of outreach. And then we're going to do that, and then have a series of boards up so that folks can do kind of exhibit type kind of planning activity where you can see the boards and you can do some level of post-it kind of sticking, and then you can kind of move on, and it could be one person at a time. So there's a lot of little mitigations we're doing to your typical kind of engagement activity. So I think we're testing that out this weekend to see if it's how's it feel for everybody, and I think the city's like putting their finger back out into trying to do these kind of activities in partnership. So DOT's working on that with us. That's one example. I mean, the Zoom stuff has been really interesting, actually, from my perspective. I've seen community groups like Community Coalition use it really well with their constituency, their community members and their base, still be able to have community meetings, really actively engaging with their base. I'm sure they're missing some folks because, you always have to be mindful of the digital divide, but I know that they are actively, it's been very good for them. And I think this has opened up a whole nother lane of community engagement opportunity moving forward, where they'll probably still do some of this even when they go back to regular meetings and being able to do in-person stuff. It just opens up another lane, I think, of engagement. The last example I'll put out before I pass to the mic, I think relates to social media. I do think that, folks are spending as much time as they are on their phones and engaging on social. I've seen some groups do a really, really great job of doing weekly bulletins on their Instagrams to their constituency and doing news flash kind of stuff and really doing a lot of educational, informational kind of engagement. And then doing some of the with the comment section, doing some of the back and forth kind of engagement that you kind of want in order to sort of do a little bit more kind of organizing kind of conversation with folks. So I think folks are you're looking at the tools that they have and really, going full bore on them. And I've been really amazed by some of the stuff I've seen from community groups, testing out the waters with some of the technology. And, with phones the way they are, so many more folks have more technology in front of them. So I do think it's a good idea for us to be leaning into that while we still have to be mindful of getting back out in the streets and getting down. Because, I think folks are out there engaging. I think about places like Leimert Park on a Sunday. You go to Leimert Park on a Sunday these days, the community's out, and there's an opportunity to engage with folks there. Of course, I think mask concerns and, we're in the middle of this pandemic. I think we have to be crazy mindful about that and think more and more about ways to, really ensure that we're educating folks about how to be out safely and how to do this, right? And then we all learn and adapt as things go. That being said, I think it is, it's worth the work to figure this out.
Great. Any other comments on that before I move on to a related question?
I would just add, I love the way that Zoom democratizes authority. I think the boxes just kind of pop up however people are. And I think that, community meetings where you're not building barriers, we're against the panelists at the top and like speaking to the audience in community meetings. And I think that, Zoom has kind of allowed us to virtually create that. I love Irma, and I've loved her as long as I've met her. And I love what she said around like language, and just thinking about, if we had a community meeting virtually in a predominantly Spanish speaking community, what if it was Spanish only on the Zoom and you had to call into a line to hear English translation? Like thinking about that and the equitable access of it, because if you were trying to really create the information transfer to the residents. And, at River LA, we created an augmented reality app. It's this great shiny thing, but it defaults in Spanish, right? Because, primarily the residents along the river are Spanish speaking. And we wanted to make that known, like first thing, right? Like we're doing it for them. And does that hurt, when people download it and they're like, oh man, mine's in Spanish, probably, it probably makes people, have to switch it over. But we were intentionally trying to make it for the community members. So I think that just that step, I think technology can actually do that easier for us if we create the opportunity for people to have access to it.
Great. I want to shift a little bit and talk about, we've talked a lot about what is, why community engagement, how can it look, what does effective community engagement look like, how do we do it in this current era? I want to shift a little bit to learn from you all, since you've been on the front lines and in the grassroots of what are the concerns that you hear, in particular about, the results of big investments in things like Metro lines, Taylor Yard, other big investment projects, and how they impact housing, whether it's how it's available, how affordable it is. Yeah, I'm just curious, what do those concerns look like in each of the places that you all?
Well, I can talk specifically for Crenshaw, and I'll do it quickly. A lot of the potential results that are, seen for infrastructure improvements are typically seen from a academic perspective that is coming from a certain, northeastern or northwestern perspective, which is not South LA, right? So like when you put all of these like very high density studio or one bedroom, no parking results on South LA businesses, like or South LA residents, you are essentially building for the place where those academics lived, right? So I think that the issue with kind of the theory going into practice is that in that transition, there's no practical conversation with the residents to understand how they would actually use these resources that come about when this infrastructure happens. And then the second thing is all of the economic development that is celebrated when these projects go in is not talked about being captured in the community. It's talked about being captured citywide or statewide, but there's no mechanism to actually capture it inside of the community so the residents can benefit. So I think there's been a couple times people were talking about capturing the value. And I think that is essentially what infrastructure improvements are missing when they go into the community.
Yeah. Irma, I wonder if you have any thoughts. I know there's been a lot of investment on the LA River recently after many years and decades of neglect, and by powerful and wealthy institutions, and things have really shifted. Curious, what are you hearing from your communities you work in about the impact of new investments in places like Taylor Yards, and what is that? What is the word on the street on that? Irma, are you there? Okay, we'll move on. I'm curious, Mariana. I know that.
Okay, can you hear me?
Okay.
Hello?
Yep, I can hear
Can
you
you
now.
hear me?
Yes, Irma.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Somehow it just gets unmuted. Okay, well, that's a very interesting question because what the majority of people we talk to is meetings, because we are not going to, our children are not going to take advantage of what's being built because rents are going up, gentrification's happening. So why should we encourage all this great development when we're the ones who are going to be the victims of it? And I can give you a number of examples where Marsh Park was built, a beautiful park right next to the LA River, and then a state-of-the-art condominium, I think 3 floors, was built. And then all of a sudden, people got rent increases and people couldn't afford to live where they are. So people are seeing that there's no connection between their participation, advocating for what they want, and then actually benefiting from it. They said this is going to be enjoyed by someone else, but not our children. And so that's very discouraging to me, because I have to figure out, okay, so what's the answer? Because the truth is that they're telling me the truth, how they feel. And I've seen that time over and over. The interesting part about the issue around the LA River, I've been involved with it since the LA River Master Plan. We did engagement in 3 areas of Canoga Park and 2 other areas along the LA River, is that everybody loves the river. Everybody wants to be a part of the river. The river is what connects many neighborhoods and communities, not just nearby, but the city of Los Angeles, for us to say that we actually have a river. And so it is a unifying force that I think we need to focus more on, this unifying force, so that we can create a river that long desires to be vibrant and to live. I think she's been I use the river as a she, but I know it's a he. She's been overlooked, and she's been ignored, and she's been getting a lot of attention. And one of the biggest issues with the LA River is that most of the lands near it are contaminated lands. And so people have had a lot of fear in their hearts. And so what we try to do is put facts in their head. And so the way what you do is that you tell people the history of the land. You go all the way back to the natives who were there. And in Taylor's Yard, you talk about the Union Pacific. What did they do? How long were they there? What did they do that there's more hot spots of contamination than other spots? So it's really interesting that folks know more about what's happening with the river than actual experts and people that we bring to talk to them, because they do their studies, they research, they want to know what's going on. And community members are a little reluctant to share what they want. They see they've lost their sense of neighborhood. They've lost their neighbors. They see old houses being bought and rebuilt. So what's happening all along the Northeast LA area is that the whole concept of neighborhood has changed. The whole concept of home has changed. The fabric of a neighborhood is falling apart. It's decaying. And I used to work for a redevelopment agency in San Diego, Center City Redevelopment Corporation, and I was part of the revitalization of downtown San Diego. And I understand that change is good, but sometimes people think and have told me change is good for the privileged, for the rich, and for the few. And when people think about building something for me, I'm never part of it. And it disillusions people when they feel that they're kind of voting against their interest and their children's interests. I mean, it's really sad when you listen to people, because what they're saying is their truth, and it's a reality, and it's factual. So I think what needs to happen is that when we do build housing, or we build a community, that we have a place for everybody in that community, starting with our seniors and our young people and our students and young families. And that is the way things need to be developed. So there is a place for everybody. So it isn't seen as, oh, that's for the rich and famous, or that's for whatever. That is what a community is. It's bringing the richness of all of those individual groups and entities to work together, to enjoy community life. But seems to me that redevelopment in many cases means that the very poor, and the barely making it are not part of anybody's consideration. And that's wrong. It's morally wrong. It's ethically wrong. And that's why I've known about the Crenshaw project since it first started. And I have to admire you for the work that you've done. I live only 2 miles away from there, and I've heard all of these great works, because whether people agree with you or not, they feel like they're listened to, and they're participating, and that you're respecting them. And that's what community engagement is all about, is respect for a person's voice. And it's listening to that. And so I guess I overspoke here, but communities, mothers especially, are very scared for their kids' future and for their own. And what's happening is a lot of them are renting rooms in houses, And that's a tragedy. We have 4 kids and a mother living renting a room in a house in Cypress Park. And there's example after example after example. So I think that the only reason I'm able to get these answers so bluntly and so truthfully is because they trust me and they respect that I'm not going to use their words against them.
Yeah.
Just want to say, ditto. I think me and Jason can think about the.
To inform people as I'm trying to do that here with all of you.
Great. Did you get cut off? Sorry?
Yeah, I realized that Irma was still talking. I think that's why I stopped. But I was just going to say that I think when me and Jason think about what we hear from residents in the Crenshaw district, it very much mirrors a lot of the sentiment Irma's expressed. And you know that those fears shade every conversation you want to have about changing a neighborhood. Period. Point blank. From a bike lane to a housing development. And you know, the more we talk about housing reflecting people, I think the better off we'll be in this conversation. Like, you know, how do people want to live? Like so many folks want to live with their grandparents, with their elders in the same complex, within the same. And you get to always see when you see a building come in, you can always tell when they don't want families because of how it's designed, like straight up, right? Like, and I think that dynamic is one we have to break down, where we build for people and the people who are there, and not for some prospective people that we hope to attract.
Yeah, that's so important. And I'm going to follow up on that question in a second. But I wanted to see, Mariana, if you had any thoughts or comments in terms of what are the concerns that you hear, or that all the many dozens of member organizations of ACT LA here about the impact on housing of new investments in Metro and the LA River and other big public investment infrastructure projects.
Yeah, I think just dittoing a lot of what other folks have already shared, but I think in the last couple of years, in the city of LA and in the county, we've passed measures like parks revitalization and public infrastructure, public transit investments, and like housing investments. So I think it's been critical that equity groups have been involved in those conversations, because there's still a lot of concerns around, the displacement pressures that come with these new investments while they're creating a more connected and sustainable and, greener region. It's going to come at the expense of like long-time residents, low-income people who may not always have access to these, benefit or these new investments. So I think LA City has some of the strongest tenant protections if you look at the rest of the county, yet we still have so much vulnerability to gentrification and displacement in the city, right? So if you're looking at areas outside of LA City where new transit is coming in, like there's no protections. So I think we have to, like, before these investments are coming into these neighborhoods or these, corridors, we have to ensure that we're including the strongest possible protections before transit or any projects break ground. So I think those are the concerns that we're hearing a lot from community members.
Yeah. I mean, I know I've heard a lot from all of you, from others about, partly it's worry about what displacement looks like in terms of being moved away from family and social services and other things, moved further from jobs and requiring very long commutes, but also losing that sense of home and belonging, place that you've lived for many years. Maybe your family's been here for decades or centuries. So, I think that certainly seems like a recurring theme. I want to kind of follow up on something, Tafara, that you said, just about like knowing when a certain kind of housing development comes in. It's like, are the number of bedrooms like built and the structure of the aesthetic of it, even like, it's not about just the amount of money being sunk in, but like how it's being designed, the design, like signaling, indicating and signaling to the general public, like, who is this for? And so I'd love to ask all of you, maybe Tafari and you, Jason, want to start, but talking about how is design used to signal change? How can it be used? How is it used negatively? But how can we use it? And how can builders and planners use it positively to show and mean that the existing community there should stay and will be enabled to stay? Just like even on the design angle in particular.
I actually let Jason open this one up because he hits when he talks about this. You're on mute.
I appreciate that. So I think when it comes to design, design has been weaponized in the Black community. And typically because everything that is designed for the Black community doesn't account for Black people. And that's because of the lack of Black designers. That's because we have given the word designer some authority and access that, you know, it's a person that has an idea, right? And our community members can also participate in that. So I think if we allowed our participators to be, our residents to be participators in the design, then we'd have something that actually is admissible for the community members. What I'd also say is there is an assigned value to new design that is typically above the community value that exists when it comes to developers, right? So like you have a very kind of modern Nordic, straight lines, white background, steel numbers, sort of aesthetic that is assigned a high value. So that valuation then creates the gentrification and displacement that attacks and displaces community members. So I think that, you know, in order to really try to think about what design is, we have to really go directly to designers and architects and say, like, you know, are you intentionally doing this? Because these are the impacts that are happening because of it. And in Destination Crenshaw, we explicitly worked with Black architects and designers, right? Like we wanted them to really think about what Black design is for the future of communities so that we can then have a case study around, can it exist? Does it exist, right? Because we can't actually solve the question until we try. And I think it then becomes a model where we can have a conversation about it, because a lot of our conversations with community members are really about the design of it, about the aesthetic of it. Do you feel like this represents you? And I think that the story of our design, being that it comes from North African stargrass, which is a grass that migrated from Africa to this country and actually is seen in all 50 states naturally. That actually talks to the migration to LA and then from LA for Black people. And I think that conversation, that intentionality allows for people in our community to see this project as seeing them and not being a way to move them out or erase their existence.
Thank you. That's powerful.
I mean, the one thing I would add, I think, is when I joined the project, what really struck me and got me jazzed was just how when you started talking about a 1.3 mile art museum, but then you immediately need to start talking about what's happening in the sidewalks and streets and vacant lots that attach to those spaces, and really tease out what I think is a very important design conversation. Like, you know, you might be talking about your building, but like, what about all the quote unquote negative space outside of that building that really is knitting your building into the fabric of the culture of the community around you, and how those conversations need to inform each other. So, and you know, for us, for Destination Crenshaw, it meant bike lanes and pedestrian improvements along this corridor. It meant pocket parks, and it meant, you know, and trees, right? And how are you knitting this space together in a way that enhances culture and lifestyle, and it speaks to the culture and lifestyle of the residents of that community as they exist and as they want to exist, as they idealize they want to exist, where they want to go, you know? I think that aspect of design not just your space, but all the other space, and how that factors. I feel like it leads us more towards, like what this equitable design sort of framework that, that ties things together. Which I think is, that's what all this is about: tying community together, tying people together, tying things together.
It reminds me that, so much of this design, it's about who the designers are and where they're coming from, where their life experiences are, and then how are they co-designing with residents, and not assuming, it's as much about that process as it is about having a fixed idea of like what is the kind of, what do people of that, stereotypically of that particular community's, racial, ethnic, class background want. But actually it's process is going to lead you to that place where you are truly. Mariana or Irma, I wanted to see if you had any thoughts about about how design can be used to alienate. What are examples of that? And on the flip side, what are positive examples of where design can foster that sense of cohesion and community?
Well, people want to live in places that they can relate to and make them feel comfortable and welcomed. They don't want to go into spaces that are concrete, that have no life, that have no greenery, no trees. And when we talk to seniors at the senior housing over on San Fernando Road, right next to the G2 parcel, we asked them, are you happy here? They said, yes, it gives us a nice place to be, but if it only had more trees, and if it only had a rotunda like back home, people want to live in places that bring back great memories, that aren't sterile, and have a human and a big element of nature, and that they feel comfortable in. I agree with the notion that a lot of things are designed to make it clear. Like when you see a lot of stairs, well, who can't live there, and if there's no parking and so on and so forth. But, I think that people really want more of a home, regardless if it's an apartment or condominium or a house. They want a home. And the definition of home is changing so radically. People want to hold on to that because it means family. It means togetherness. It means strength. And we seem to be getting away from that. And I think that design, I agree. And I really very much agree with the notion that when you see folks that look like you, it inspires young people to want to become designers or become architects or become engineers. So we need to do a better job of the vendors that are hired, that they reflect the rich diversity of the city, because I don't see it. And if we truly want to inspire young people when they see scientists or geologists or engineers and they look like them, those young kids are inspired. If they can do it, surely I can do it. And I think that speaks even louder, in my opinion, is that we have to be intentional about the folks that we bring in to work on these projects, especially in communities of color, that they truly understand the culture, the history, the language, the traditions, and what's important to them, and listen for that and ask for that. And, because community does have a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom, and we need to listen to that and give people the opportunity to express it.
100%. Mariana, any thoughts? I know you're not a designer by training, but
I'm not a designer, but I mean, I think just like, some things that we hear from community members are kind of like what Tafari mentioned, right? Like this negative space that like is how people engage, right? Like it's like the front yards, the cottages where people can like see each other, versus these like boxy buildings where you never run into your neighbors. I think that this is something where community members, they want to be able to have those interactions with community members, whether it's in the front yard as they're, you know, going on their walks, or you know, going back into their apartment, you know, things like that. So and those are some of the like design things that you heard that you know, these like tall, you know, horizontal fences that, you know, are now called the gentrification fences, like blocking people's view, like creating this like anonymity of people, is what really is exclusionary, and it's really like threatening to community members, right? So I think like the like open front yards and like walking up is what people value in their communities.
Yeah, it's almost the difference, you know, how is space welcoming versus hostile? You know, how is it, you know, creating public space to congregate and to be in, and versus just keeping others out. And I know James Rojas, who's a planner and does some really interested, he writes a lot about Latino and Latin urbanism, but also has interesting tools for community engagement around planning. I know, I'm sure he would have a lot to say about this. So folks can look him up. But yeah, I think this is all really important, and I think we're surfacing some of the things, the types of buildings, the certain kind of Scandinavian design, or these horizontal fences that become signals, but also the reality of who things are being built for. So before I move on from questions of design to kind of like policy and material benefits and material measures to keep people in place, I'm curious if there's anything else that comes to mind for any of you around like what are really other designs that are really alienating that you've seen, and what are really, really positive?
I mean, do I need to call out the Orsinis, the Medicis, and those other kind of faux Italian monstrosities downtown? I mean, there was, I'm just remember some specific design aesthetics that I heard that were employed, or you can observe that are employed, where, you know, all the residents of these buildings, they walk in walkways as opposed to ever being put into the street space and walking in the streets. And, you know, like these tall foreboding kind of walls on every periphery. So if you're just a resident and they were walking around these spaces, you know, you have no kind of no inability. It feels like a fortress, right? It feels like a giant castle. So I think those dynamics are, you know, as much as we can stop replicating those, I mean, I'll just put that out there. Like, no more of those things.
Great. If no one else wants to jump in on that, I'm gonna move. Talk a little bit about, you know, what are the kind of policy solutions that that your organizations have worked on, or you know of, but especially that you've worked on yourselves, that would really ensure that public investments benefit communities, and that in particular how we, you know, get new housing that that is for existing members of the community and has potential to bring in some people who will be willing to join rather than alienate kind of the existing community. If that makes sense. I can try to rephrase, but I'll see if anybody has an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some examples of housing design that I think need to be replicated more. So I mean, growing up in South LA, the duplexes, the fourplexes, like that level of development has always seems very appealing to families, you know, very functional for differing incomes. You know, it helps create density on a single lot in ways that aren't very, you know, off-putting to surrounding kind of single family density and stuff. The accessory dwelling unit stuff that's been going on is obviously, you know, that came out of a bunch of community conversations around ways to create density in single family home neighborhoods. I definitely am, you know, a big supporter of those policy moves. And I think also, you know, opportunity. I've noticed that with a lot of more folks are going into the situation where they're buying a property, but then bringing a friend in and then buying it together or creating this kind of financial structure, but also the development itself is built in a way where there's 2 units on it, or there's ways you could subdivide in a way that really makes sense for 2 families or whatnot. So I feel like, the ways where we can design for that more intentionally and create more opportunities for land trust type structures or communal ownership structures, I think is a very, progressive way to go. Just as some thoughts.
I know there's been an explosion of interest in things like social housing and tenant-owned properties, community-owned properties, and I know a lot of work happening, many housing groups and Healthy LA Coalition, other spaces around. How do we give community, how do we give tenants the first opportunity to purchase these things so we can move in that direction? So there is literal, financial and legal control by residents, and then that I think probably will lead to more interesting explorations of, okay, what kind of building typology do we have? What do we want to design if we control this? And if you're not alienated from it, if it's not some outside developer coming in and building it, you're more likely to feel like, okay, let's experiment. Let's see what will work for us in our community. Mariana, I'm curious, and Irma, feel free to answer this as well. What are some of the policy solutions that you think will help us ensure that public investments are really going to benefit communities and the community as a whole?
Yeah, so I can talk about a couple examples. The TOC policy at Metro, so Transit-Oriented Communities policy, which was adopted by Metro a couple years ago. So it's more of a county Metro policy, but it's actually it's a policy that will allow for Metro to take responsibility for the displacement pressures that happen when new investments are coming into neighborhoods. So ensuring that when new developments are happening, that there's some protections for tenants, for inclusionary requirements. However, this policy doesn't have the funding behind it, so it doesn't have a lot of teeth. So I think ensuring that we can actually implement that policy in a way that's meaningful, that will require cities or require the areas that are getting new transit investment to put in place protection for tenants or inclusionary housing requirements when they're receiving these tangible construction of transportation. So that's one policy example, but again, it's going to take some work to make sure that gets implemented in a way that has the best impact on the ground. And then I think the TOC policy in LA, the Transit-Oriented Communities Affordable Housing program, which definitely is, I don't want to say controversial, but it's both great because it's creating a lot of housing in areas that have not constructed housing in many, many years, and it's including housing for extremely low income households. But I also think there's things that we need to do to improve on that by making sure that we're not demolishing, rent stabilized buildings and, taking away existing affordable housing to build, some new housing. So I think the work that some opportunities I think right now around the community plan updates in the city of LA, or the housing element update, the general plan update. So a lot of these plans, that are kind of on a really long timeline, but I think are really good opportunities to ensure that we're improving on the TOC program that the city of LA has, which is actually creating a lot of affordable housing and protecting people and providing benefits, right, where we're seeing new investments.
I know that the La Rosa Collaborative and SECA and many others have worked very hard to get things, anti-displacement provisions into Measure A, which is a parks initiative, and thinking whenever you use a big new pot of money, big new program, how do you think about anti-displacement and affordable housing and housing creation as an integral part of the process and not secondary? I want to, Irma, direct a question to you, if you're up for it, and ask, what kind of building, Tafari mentioned, the appeal of the duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. Are there kinds of building types Oh, Irma has dropped off the call. Okay, so I won't ask this question. I was going to ask about kind of building types and what's attractive. We'll come back to that when she's on the call. I'm curious, what is, for all of you, what is your what's your vision for growth in Los Angeles? How do we accommodate new housing and density in single family and low rise neighborhoods? And what does that look like to you? How have you thought about that? So anyone feel free to jump in on that question. Easy one, right?
Well, I think coming from New York to Los Angeles and working in affordable housing in New York, and then coming here, I was contracted by the space, right? Like immediately I was like, oh, there's opportunity here. We're not all going after one parcel to build. So I think that because of that space, I think that opportunity exists for new housing. The second thing I think really happened to me, because the first place I worked at was River LA, I had an Eastern orientation to the city of Los Angeles. So I don't really go to the beach. I live in South LA, and a lot of the things I do, I drive east for, right? So like I really have a different orientation to the city than what was kind of popular knowledge. So what it made me do is realize that, oh, normal people live here, right? So like, that was like my second thing. And then the third thing that happened is that because of the river, I think about Los Angeles as communities, right? Like it is a aggregation of all these different communities that makes up Los Angeles. Like I don't see like one aesthetic that is like an overarching thing. So to me, I think the future of community design and community development is community specific. So like it is in that specific area doing projects and having community design that is of that specific aesthetic, right? Because there is not one answer for the LA River, and I figured that out really quickly. And I think that there's not one answer for Los Angeles. So I think the democratization of community development can actually have multiple benefits. So like it allows community members to feel heard. It allows our political representation to actually have some teeth in the conversation and be able to actually move their authority through community members, which actually reinforces the ties of democracy. And then the third is like, if you're able to capture that investment, then you incentivize people to actually participate in their community development. So some of that policy that we talked about, like if we're getting our community members to actually reinvest in their community and create those duplexes or triplexes, then we're actually able to have people creating the ecosystem, right? And then they're reinvesting in their communities, which then makes schools better. It makes so many things better. So I think that LA has an opportunity that doesn't exist in other places, where we can actually create models of participation that actually scale up, and we can pilot, right? Like we can pick different communities and we can pilot these things and see if they work. If they don't work, we can create new options and new solutions. So I think, it's all community driven for me, and starting small, but really understanding that we can replicate and scale.
Great. I'm curious if the other panelists have thoughts on what's your vision for growth for LA? How do we accommodate new housing, new density in these low-rise neighborhoods, the single-family neighborhoods? Or single family, I'm sure there's a lot of people doubled up in a lot of these places, doubled to tripled up or more.
I can jump in here. Yeah, this is a really big question. I feel like I also was born and raised in East LA, and so much of like what I want to do always depends on like, is there parking? Am I gonna go there or not because there's no parking, right? And I don't want that. I want to be able to like jump on the train or jump on a bus and just get to where I want to be. Or preferably like have more options to live closer to. I also don't go to the beach too much, but I'd like to, like if I had things to do out in the West Side, right? So just like having more housing options in areas that have bigger lot sizes, right? So like West LA and the Valley, in areas where for a long time have not built housing, right? Like let's look at how we can accommodate homes there. you know, and especially where new transit is coming in, right? Like, let's connect where new transit is coming, where the jobs are being created, and, you know, make sure that we're putting housing there that's affordable, that can accommodate different incomes, and particularly people who have been excluded for a very long time. So, you know, I think ideally we should have a city that's way more connected via public transportation, that's, you know, affordable and accessible. So I think there's definitely opportunities for creating some density in single family neighborhoods. And then in areas that are already more, you know, commercial corridors actually have the like density that could fit the community. And of course, I agree with Jason that like that development has to be community specific, or those designs have to be really community specific, so that we're not just like saying this area should have this kind of density and this area has this kind of density. I think it should be really driven by the community.
Yeah.
I ditto everything everybody else said. And I think the one dynamic I would add to it is I just think a re-emphasis on building kind of like, I mean, I have this kind of theme thing I've been working with, like living and loving locally. Like, I mean, really getting back to the idea of like supporting neighborhood level kind of community building, development, like small little restaurants, supporting business development so that folks have things walkable to them more so, right? Have things within a mile of them more so. A lot of us do have some level of community neighborhood that, you know, we can get to. Some neighborhoods don't have as much and we can be developing it more, but I think building a stronger culture about that across the city, along with everything else everybody else said, right? Like building more affordable housing across the city in neighborhoods that don't build housing, like creating more opportunities and increasing density in certain areas, very neighborhood specific development, but really living and loving locally, building out this sort of identity around our city where we can sort of reconnect around our neighborhoods and encouraging that kind of neighborhoods life, I think is a huge part of it. You know, giving folks those resources and the safe streets to do it. You know, a lot of this is simply about people not feeling ever safe to cross a street in their neighborhood, simply not feeling safe to walk down a street. From everything from, you know, some neighborhoods, these conversations get really complex around like gang stuff and whatever. And then in some neighborhoods, it's simply like these cars drive really fast and I can't cross this street. And like, I think, and everything in between. I think those dynamics we need to break down some too. I think in order to get at this idea of, you know, a more kind of equitable housing situation. Frankly, you know, I think because it gets to things that Jason talked about local economics too, right? So supporting those small businesses, supporting that local life means supporting community economics that will get more people employed, will build more equitable economic stability for families who potentially live in that same community. And I think those dynamics, I think we need to get back to and support as a city. I think that will be it's an important part of our future.
Great. As I move us towards wrapping up, and I feel like we could spend another hour or two, but I know we want to keep it to roughly about an hour and a half. I have two wrap-up questions, and I'm going to combine them and also combine it with the opportunity for you to have a closing. So one question or set of questions is, how do we pursue housing models that protect existing residents and make room for new ones? What kind of designs or planning approaches might succeed with that? So that's question number one. Question number two is, how do we think the pandemic might have changed the way people want to live, and what housing is accordingly more attractive? So those are two questions, and would love to hear from each of you, either answer to one, answer to both, plus, you know, other thoughts you might have. Really want to wrap us up on that, those big questions. They're easy. Yeah.
I spoke first the last time. You guys go ahead.
I can start. I'll answer the second question first. I think as I go around my neighborhood, I feel like people, with the pandemic, people want to be outside more, right? So I think like being able to have a neighborhood where you could just walk around or go on a jog or do your grocery shopping, and within a walking distance, which, we've already talked about, is has become even more critical now for people as we are confined to our homes for such long periods of time. So I think, you know, walkability, having access to, you know, healthy, safe transportation is really, really important now. And it always has been and should have been, right? But I think it's even becoming more important. And I also think, like, as, you know, people feel more socially isolated, I think, like, being able to live with friends or family has also become so much more valuable or like necessary. And for so many people here, like, that has always been our situation, right? Like, we've lived with our grandparents, or, like, you know, rented the back home in our parents or parents home, grandparents home. So I think, like, that is also something that is really important in this new era. So I think that that's how I would sort of approach that. And I'm sorry, I already forgot the first question. It was like 2 long questions.
It was about, you know, what kind of design or planning approaches can help us keep existing residents there and make room for new ones.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it.
Yeah. All right. Let's hear from others.
I'll go. I was trying to get the mute on going, and Jason's being difficult. So I feel like I think, you know, everything Mariana has kind of hit the nail on the head, I think, on a lot of levels. I think the only thing I would add is, yeah, people just, I know for me, it's funny, right at the top of the pandemic, I was living in Koreatown, and like in February, this was like, you know, I'm done with this. I'm gonna move. I'm gonna find a new spot. And then I signed my lease, and then like a week later, they were like, yeah, we're about to shut down the city. And I was like, wow, timing. And then that move from me, I've realized that move from a much more dense, you know, kind of more one of our more urban-y kind of neighborhoods to, I'm in mid-city now. And so it's a little bit more low rise, a little bit more relaxed. I don't feel like I'm living around top of people, which I feel like over there. I feel like that dynamic, I don't know if that's just me because of my moment right now, but I feel like that is kind of the energy. Like, you know, like, we're glad we're not New York. We're glad we're not built like that. And I don't think that that's something that even feels more attractive anymore. There was a moment where we felt like we wanted to build up in certain neighborhoods. You know, of course, some neighborhoods were really resisting it. But I just wonder about, you know, how residents feel about, you know, the densities in that way. I think, and then to your first question, I think, you know, accessory dwelling units. I'm thinking bungalow housing. I mean, we have a lot of old school models in LA of really cool apartments where you have like relatively small units on one lot, and everybody shares a yard, and everybody shares some common space, and you have your own private space. I think we need to look in our planning codes and make those viable again, and really get back at that kind of densification, where you're really building around people's culture and creating opportunities for communities to be built, not just boxes, and what that starts to entail.
Great. Jason?
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, I think that hopefully the pandemic has brought a more human focus on solutions instead of, you know, the pro forma and the profit. You know, I think that, you know, when you're thinking about density from a standpoint of the most money you could possibly make, you're going to put a bunch of studios on top of a bunch of studios because that is just, I mean, it just equals out, right? But when you're thinking about the human sort of usage of it and the experience of it, I think that allows more opportunity for what everybody's been saying. So, you know, it's, to me, the conversations and not only the pandemic, but also the social unrest. You know, I think that, you know, thinking about Black people as an important aspect of your community should make developers and designers want to talk to Black people about designing in their neighborhoods, right? Like, if you are actually doing the work that you say you're doing. And I think that to have that be something that is said out loud instead of something that we just feel and hold in, I think is an opportunity for us as a city, because we could start acknowledging, like, you know, are we creating spaces for all different types of people? to live and exist together and build that connected community that everybody's talking about.
Yeah. Do you have anything else, Mariana? Or else I'll wrap it up. Great. Well, I think this has been incredibly productive, showing the ability of what we can do on Zoom, even though we're not in the same room, unfortunately. I think, as we think about how do we pursue policies that, that and models of design and planning and that financing that protect existing residents from both being able to stay physically, economically, culturally, and also invite new folks in. I mean, there's so many. I think we've heard so many rich ideas here that I can't even fully summarize. But I think the two big things are, one, design process that that is inclusive and truly engaging and basically leads to buildings that and spaces and that people want to be in and around is so important. And then ensuring, figure out ways that they not only are they not displacing people immediately, but are have elements of affordability built in for a wide range of people, whether that's through things like social housing, where a variety mixed income social housing where people of all incomes can live together, or things like inclusionary zoning and many other policy solutions, tenant-owned purchases, community-owned purchases. The list goes on and on. So I think you've all given us a lot of food for thought, and I really appreciate your participation, your contribution, and all the amazing work that you all do. And now I want to throw it to Christopher Hawthorne to close us out.
Thanks so much, David. First of all, let me thank you for terrific facilitating, and thank our panelists and Irma, who had to drop off, for all of her thoughtfulness. This has been a really, really rich and productive conversation. And when I think about the audience for all of these sessions, which will be architects, landscape architects, those who work in communities, those who think about design and think about planning, an incredibly rich set of ideas for them to think about, respond to, learn more about. I think this will take them in a lot of directions to discover more about the history of the communities that you've been talking about. So thank you to all of you. This is exactly the kind of conversation we envisioned when we were beginning to think about how to put this set of listening sessions at the beginning of our process. And I was really struck by something Tafari said about, it's a very straightforward phrase, housing that reflects people, thinking about all the ways in which that can be produced in our approach to architecture, to land use, to planning, to all the things that we're going to be digging into in this design challenge and this larger initiative about the future of low-rise communities across the city. So thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks for the great questions that you added to the chat. And thanks again to David and our panelists. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.